Okay, thanks for coming, everybody. We are here today for Kaija Straumanis, but with her permission, I wanted to say a few words about her dad, Andres. Andres was a keynote speaker at our Independence Day celebration in this exact room almost exactly 2 years ago, and he passed away last year in September. Andres Straumanis was the foremost, the irreplaceable historian of the Latvian diaspora and the Latvian diaspora press. He was a professor of communication and media studies at the University of Wisconsin, River Falls, and he was an important mentor to me. Andres and I shared a profession. I'm also a professor of communication and media studies. He studied Latvians, and so do I. He taught journalism, so do I. But he was well ahead of me. He was the communication division chair of the Association for the Advancement of Baltic Studies before me. He did everything before me. He knew everything before me. I remember being at a conference with him, and I loved seeing him at conferences. He was always so funny and kind, and he actually cared about whatever I was speaking on at the conference. Anyway, this must have been Seattle in 2022, and I must have told him that I was going to be speaking at this Biedrība on the occasion of its 130th anniversary. So in the middle of his research presentation, he pauses and he leans over towards me. He says, "Jāni, remember this part." And then he brought up Kristaps Rusis and Kristaps Raviņš, who edited a newspaper called Amerikas Atbalsts. That newspaper advocated for American recognition of an independent Latvia, and they were Philly guys. So paldies, Andri, for helping me write my speech. Andres was a model scholar, absolutely meticulous, but he was a special brand. He didn't just do academic research. He was creative. He didn't spend all his time trying to get into peer-reviewed journals, although he did that. But he found other ways to bring knowledge to light and to make it engaging and useful. He built websites. He wrote journalism. He figured out how to make digital interactive maps and digital repositories of information. He was an amazing photographer. He was an amazing writer, and he never stopped learning. He was the kind of scholar that I try to be. And he helped me figure that out. I wish I could talk to him about my new radio show. I wish I could have his feedback on my Latvian anarchist episode. How was it that there were two professors studying Latvian media with an interest in anarchists? How lucky was I to meet Andres Straumanis? When Andres was in Philadelphia for our Independence Day celebration, we drove to West Philly immediately after the ceremony to find the street that had the most dense population of Latvian Baptists. Andres knew where, of course, but he hadn't gotten there, even when he came to the Baltic Studies Conference at the University of Pennsylvania. We found first the old site of the church. It was gone, just like the Latvians. We kept walking, and we found a block that Andres said was almost entirely once inhabited by Latvians. My daughter Lila was still in her tautastarps, and she was twirling around the empty street, and Andres was grinning from ear to ear. The Latvians had returned. That was the last time I saw him, and I'll always remember him with that smile on his face. Lai tavas smiltis vieglas, Andri. Kaija Straumanis is an award-winning translator of Latvian literature. She won a 2015 At Seal Book Award for Best Translation into English for High Tide by Inga Abele. If you don't know, At Seal is the American Association of Teachers of Slavic and East European Languages and the main academic organization for the study of literature and linguistics from the region. She has an MA in literary translation from the University of Rochester, where she is now editorial director of Open Letter Books, an important nonprofit literary translation press dedicated to increasing access to world literature for English language readers. In 2020, she won a translation fellowship from the National Endowments for the Arts for a book called Forest Daughters, a collection of 12 oral histories of women who were in the thick of the partisan fight against the Soviet occupation following the Second World War. Everyone knows about the Forest Brothers, and this book will help fill an important gap in the history of that period. On the NE website, she wrote, "I believe this fellowship will give even greater recognition to the value of Latvian literature, its history, and the largely unmined treasure trove of the people who author both. Ours may be a small and generally introverted country, but it's here, it's wonderful, and it packs a pretty serious punch, be it in its literature, its rye bread, or yes, even its Olympic beach volleyball teams." Meža, meitas, Forest Daughters, is the first nonfiction book I have set foot in as translator, and I'm looking forward to spending more time with the 12 voices editor and anthropologist Sanita Reinsone has collected in its pages. It's an honor to be able to work on bringing these women's stories into English. Kaija was able to earn such a prestigious grant because she was already so highly accomplished, already having published 7 books of translation, winning a major award, and serving as a visiting professor at the University of Iowa. I will add that she is also a very talented photographer, like her dad, and has published photos in Scientific American, FHM China, and elsewhere. It is an honor to present to you today Kaija Straumanis.
Hello, thank you. I want to say paldies to Jānis for the introduction and the beautiful words about my father. I don't fully believe in like Mercury retrograde and moon stuff, but if anyone does, it's doing some hinky things anyway this week, so I'm already on high emotional alert, and I figured I would probably get teary because I knew Jānis would speak about my father, and then my best friend showed up after telling me last night that she would not make it, so I left my tissues, hold on, sorry. So I definitely thank you, and I will be a little emotional, and it's a great honor, so thank you, Jānis, and thank you to Petris for inviting me, and to the Philadelphia Freelets Latvian Society for having me. I also wish my dad could be here, but part of me also is, I don't know, I wish he would be here. I had a hard time because I always wanted to make him proud, and I still do. What a wonderful way to start, by crying on a video recording. But now we know the mic is working. I don't know if you can hear the tears hitting my glasses, but that is a testament to the audio quality. So what I would like to do is I would like to read a little bit from the foreword to Forest Daughters, which, as Jānis said in the introduction, is a collection of 12 stories, oral history stories, interviews with 12 women who took part in the national partisan movement. And I think also, as we are still in November, and November 18th was just last week, it's pretty fitting to talk about these things. So I will start with a little excerpt from the foreword, and then I will move on to the meat of the lecture. So the end of World War II did not bring peace to Latvia. On the contrary, it brought a new war to the country in the second half of 1944, one that dramatically changed the lives of many people and brought terror and fear to their daily existence. Forests and marshes became sites for military resistance, as well as the home for several thousand people. It seemed that almost every Latvian resident's relationship to the forest changed, regardless of whether or not he or she had been involved in the national resistance movement. The forest became a political concept, a metaphor for insubordination and the underground. To the occupying forces, the forest was an uncomfortable point of opposition that needed to be brought under control, whereas for many civilians, the forest was a place of shelter once life under Soviet rule had become too dangerous and unbearable. This also means that forests became a doubly sensitive place once military resistance started. Every visit to the forest, be it for berry picking, mushrooming, or some other daily activity, could be seen as suspicious and even result in aggressive measures on the part of both the occupying powers and the national partisans. The end of the Latvian National Partisan War is dated around the mid-1950s, and although it has been studied by museums and research institutions since the early 1990s, it is still referred to as the, quote, unknown war, since there is still so much we don't know about what happened in Latvia's forests in those first few post-war decades. This includes the role and experiences of women involved in the National Partisan War, a topic that has not yet had a historical study devoted to it. Excuse me. And this book, Forest Daughters, provides readers the opportunity to delve into the life stories of 12 Latvian women who spent time as partisans in the forests of Latvia. Their stories are poignant, powerful, and emotional, a testament to mankind's amazing ability to survive, and at the same time, a little known or entirely forgotten page of Latvia's history. Oral history gives us the privilege of seeing into the past from several unique viewpoints to get to know what people personally felt and experienced. After World War II, and in order to avoid arrest and repression, the women interviewed for this book, and many others, young country girls, students, children, became outlaws, bandits, and undesirables in the eyes of the new Soviet regime. The majority of them were neither neutral nor passive toward the Soviet regime. Before they went into the forests, they helped the national partisans, who included their own husbands, brothers, fathers, friends, and neighbors. Once in the forest, these women moved within restricted societies and lived cut off from the outside world. There was no knowing how long their underground lifestyles would last. It could be a matter of days or months, sometimes even years. These military and underground cells were led by men. They made the decisions and were the primary ones who made contact with the outside world. The women, children, and elderly stayed in the forests where it was safer. And even though the women weren't included in the planning of military campaigns, and as much as possible were kept uninformed on the movements of and actions taken by their male counterparts, and even though with few exceptions, the majority of the women truly were unarmed civilians, to go into the forest was to take a clear stance against the Soviet regime, a decision to join the war and accept all its consequences. The armed resistance against the Soviet occupation was the men's war, but it was also the first war in which Latvian women of all ages were forced to directly participate. They were on the battlefields, some even with their children by their sides. This disrupted the social order they had once known and believed in. There's no way of knowing exactly how many women in Latvia went into the forests after World War II. An article written by historian Jānis Joņevs, the text of which serves as the afterword to the Forest Daughters book, estimates the number at a little over 400, but with the disclaimer that this is the known number of women. Most of them, especially those who lived in the countryside, were supporters of the national partisans. They provided them with food, clothing, and other supplies needed to survive in the forest. These women also served as signalers and propagandists for the partisans. There was only 1 degree of separation between being a supporter and being a partisan, 1 degree separating home from the forest. 1 moment of panic and terror was all it took for them to see no other option but to literally flee into the woods. And I will, I will talk about, I also read from that translation because I will touch back on it as another example. But now, so the reason we are here, Dictionaries and Heritage. The definition of a heritage speaker is someone who grows up speaking one language with their family in the home that is different from the dominant language in the country in which they live. So, as many or most of us in this room, that means speaking Latvian at home, so we would be Latvian heritage speakers. And we maintain and speak the family language not only at home, but also in our local communities, diaspora communities, but also internationally. And many of us use our bilingualism later in life, in our careers. And I believe that heritage speakers have, as a whole, a certain perspective and set of tools that is very advantageous to the continued appreciation of Latvian culture among the diaspora. And those of you who have not yet seen the exhibit, this is one very present example of being able to access those advantages. So a little bit about me, and I'll try to keep it short because I think a lot of us have a similar trajectory, and Jānis also went through my CV. I am second generation Latvian-American, born and raised in Minnesota. I did the whole jam, went to Latvian school. We did it Saturday mornings in Minnesota. We still do. My son is there right now with my mother, despite his best efforts to skip because I'm out of state. Did that every Saturday. I went to summer camp in Gadažas in Three Rivers, Michigan, almost every summer. After college, I lived in Latvia for several years, working at a translation company. And after working at a translation company for several years, I felt very called back to literature. My bachelor's is in creative writing and literature and German. So I Googled grad schools in literary translation, and that's how I ended up in Rochester, New York, and how I ended up as editorial director at Open Letter Books. And how I ended up translating. I come from a family of very voracious readers. Both sides of my family are readers, writers, creative or otherwise. My parents read to me at night, so from a very young age, books were always around, and I've loved reading and loved books. So that kind of is the short version, long story short, of why I'm in literary translation, because where else would I be? It's what I'm the best at. And I always wanted to write creatively myself, and at a certain point kind of figured out that I didn't have the attention span for my own writing. And then once the idea of literary translation clicked for me, it was the perfect thing because someone else had already done the hard work. They wrote the book, and I still got to be creative and write and use my English language skills and my Latvian language skills in reading the Latvian. And so that was great. And then I found out that people can make a little bit of money. No, we make no money. It's not a profitable enterprise. Books are not either. But it's all for the love of the books and for me, for the language and the literature and the culture. So when I first started translating, it was mainly about the fun of it, about kind of decoding the Latvian language and getting it into English and how best to convey what even a few lines in Latvian, how you could take those few lines in Latvian that all your Latvian friends understood and that resonated with them. And the example I used from my days at Gadažas High School, a piece of a poem by one of the Egliši, Andres, I think. But the lines are, I have it in my notes, Andres Eglītis, there we go. To tautu nesalaust, tā nezudīs nekur, ko Jāņu vainag zaļš un asins kopā tur. Very rough translation is that the people that are held together by the green midsummer wreath or crown and blood connected by that, they won't be broken and they won't disappear. And that's very wordy and very awkward in English. And in Latvian, it's like, chef's kiss. It's beautiful. And so it was fun for me. So how can you take that line and then bring it to your Kendras and your Bryans in high school and go, this is what this means, and this is why it's so cool, and this is why I get goosebumps from it. And to translate, you can use a dictionary. You can do what I just did. You can just sort of off the cuff, because words are words. But it's when you start to realize that you need to fit them together to form sentences, to get the context, to get the voice of something, the essence of something, that you realize a dictionary, it won't help you. Dictionary doesn't get you that far. And it wasn't until much, much later that I was on a panel, and the moderator asked us what we kind of wanted to talk about before we had the panel. And I think I had been very frustrated, and I just said, I want to talk about why it's hard to translate why it's hard to be a translator from English into Latvian, specifically as a second-generation Latvian-American. Because there was another panelist who was a Canadian-Lithuanian woman, my parents' generation, so she had a completely different set of experiences to talk about. But that's where I started to kind of realize that the things that made me second-generation Latvian-American, female, obsessed with books, those are my that's my toolkit. Those are my superpowers, for lack of a more literary way of saying it. What I have and what makes me, my experience, is something that I can give to the translated literature, to the literature that I am translating, and access it in order to make it the best version it can be in English. So also, like many of you, those of us who are blank generation, who were born in the States or grew up in the States primarily, I grew up speaking the Latvian that my grandparents left Latvia with. There were times when I was living and working in Latvia where my colleagues would say, oh, my grandmother says words like that. And I'm like, okay, I'm 25. That's wonderful for me and your grandma. Maybe we should be friends. And even though my grandparents read magazines, I had, Mickey Mouse magazine in Latvian, eventually Cosmopolitan magazine in Latvian, the spoken language at home and in Latvian society throughout America, it generally didn't deviate too much. And because we didn't have the influence from Russia, from Russia at that time, or the changes that were happening in Latvia, that's just what happened. The first time my family and I went to Latvia was in 1994, and for the most part, people would say, oh, you have an accent. And I'm thinking, no, I speak the way that my grandparents speak. I may be a little gifted in that I believe I can turn my Minnesota on and off when I talk. We can discuss afterward whether you agree with me or not. But even in Gudazed, so I remember a teacher from Latvia, from Riga, telling me I was saying the word S, like me, wrong. And she's like, it's not S, like a platais, like a broad E, it's S. And I snapped, and I was like, that's how my grandma talks. She's from Gulbene. Do you want to call her and tell her she speaks wrong? Because I'm happy to have this conversation, and then she left me alone. But so the language did not evolve in the same way. And in Gudazed, in the Latvian school, in the Latvian community, and again, I'm happy to be told that this has changed, because that's it's kind of in my closing, I hope that it's different now, but all 4 years of Gadazets and in Latvian school, all a million years that took, it was the Rainis, it was the Aspazija, it was the Belshevitsa, and I'm not negating those at all. They are the foundational authors. That's why we all know them. That's why we all had to memorize them and remember them. But does anyone talk about the John Greens of Latvia to these kids? Does anyone, I'm seeing now in our Latvian school in Minneapolis, we do have Dogman and Captain Underpants in Latvian, and that's great because that's the weird stuff that the kids are into these days. Oh my gosh, I'm old. Okay, that's on camera. I said that for the first time, I think. I have dated myself. So the literature that we were given was very consistent. It was very tailored, and that also did not vary or deviate. So these are writers who were part of the National Awakening, and I understand why we were given these writers to focus on, but they are not the be-all, end-all of literature. Language is a living, breathing, moving, evolving thing, which is why translation is beautiful, because we can give, another life to a book. This is why Dostoevsky is translated by multiple people, and no one can agree on which version is the best, because language is a living, breathing, moving, evolving thing. And it was once I started to more consistently and on my own read contemporary Latvian authors, Inga Ābele, Jānis Joņevs, Inga Gaila, Osvalds Zebris, Jāna Egle, all these people that I, as a literature lover and book reader, started to see for the first time that Latvian literature also was a living, breathing thing that extended beyond what we had grown up with and what we had been given as kind of the history of literature. And I will talk about it. I want contemporary authors to be brought into the mix, because any people, any kids, any adults who are interested in literature or interested in translation, talk to me after. I'll give recommendations if you need places to go and look, but there's so much good stuff that Latvian authors are writing, and a lot of it is just like the Raina and the Aspazijas and the Belshevitsis, but a lot of it is I was going to say Stephen King, but I've never read Stephen King. But a lot, they can write like other world authors can write, and that's part of why I was drawn to Latvian literature in particular, and I'm kind of going on a tangent here, because I wanted people to see that Latvia was not just a country of people who were obsessed with the post-Soviet occupation identity. And a lot of the literature does hinge on that, because that's an integral part of our history. That's why the Forest Daughters book drew me in, because it's talking about the female perspective of the partisan movement. Literature is a living, breathing thing, and there's so much more that Latvian authors can give other than this post-Soviet identity. Because it would be I'll use Stephen King again. You read Stephen King for a very specific reason, because you're going to get the Stephen King kind of horror books, right? But you don't want every single book you read in English to be Stephen King. You want variety. And so I think that's one of the issues of how I was presented Latvian literature growing up, is that we were given this, box set of information. And that's what I kind of thought. I guess I thought that's what all of it was. And, if you've read all of Rainis and you think everyone else writes like Rainis too, I can do that. That's like the Cliff's Notes. I can just read the real thing and I don't need to move on. And then I found out that wasn't true, which is great. And that kind of brings me to my examples of So that's one pitfall of being, I think, a heritage speaker, is that we are not naturally in the current, the sort of ongoing flow of entertainment and information that we would be if we were in Latvia. So we know what new movies are coming out in the US, what new books are coming out in the US. Do you know what movies are coming out from Latvian directors? Do you know of this like new Latvian TV series? I think it's a comedy about a secretary. Like, do we know this? I know this only because I know the people who are involved in it. But that's one problem, is that we are isolated from our heritage in a certain way. But we do have access to it because we are heritage speakers and we can access that information in both languages. So there was a book that came out called Jelgava 94. In English, they translated it as Doom 94 because it's largely first-person narrative about this teenager in 1994 who was into heavy metal music. So that's why the English language publisher decided to go with Doom instead of Jelgava. This was a book that almost everyone who I knew in Latvia at the time was reading. My coworkers, younger friends, their parents. And it's a book that, when I read it and as I was translating it, put me in this place of, like I said, realizing that life, I mean, we know stuff. We know life goes on in Latvia. We know that. But like I said, the first time I was in Latvia was in 1994, and this book takes place in 1994, and we went to Riga and we went to the countryside, which is not at all the vibe that Jelgava 94 gives, because I saw a very closed off, very reserved Riga, and then countryside was sheep and fresh milk, and Jelgava 94 is teenagers sneaking out at night to go drink vodka in the woods, in the park, to like hitch rides, try to, I don't know what it's called in English, but just like hitch rides for free on a train to go up to Riga to meet in a park or graveyard to like exchange mixtapes from overseas. And I remember reading it and going, oh, they had normal lives too. Like, of course they did. Of course they did. But it was one of those things where until someone puts it in front of you and says, teenagers in 1994 in Latvia were just as devious as teenagers in the United States in 1994. And it makes sense, because why wouldn't they be? And so this is why read. Read, not read contemporary, read always. And it was hard. This book was hard for me in that sense, because like a reverse culture shock of realizing that life really did go on in a way that I should have assumed, should have known. And so for that book, there were a lot of Latvian neologisms, because I didn't grow up as a teenager in Latvia, so they're naming their hangout places, and I might be misremembering, but there was one that I think was the Dirstuve, which I translated, the PG version is I translated it as the poopery, as a place where the teens would just go and like get little messed up, have a cigarette, drink their parents' port wine until they were sick, that sort of thing. So I had to be creative, and also double check with the author to make sure that I wasn't, kind of giving a misnomer to an already oddly named place. I didn't know anything about heavy metal. I had never listened to Nirvana before I started translating that book. So that was an experience. I didn't know, as a result, I didn't know any heavy metal terms. So I'm reading these heavy metal music terms as they are transliterated into Latvian and having to reverse transliterate them into Google to try to figure out what he's talking about. Is it an instrument or a piercing or a cult ritual people thought heavy metal musicians did? And most of the time when I didn't understand something, that sounded vaguely Russian or transliterated, I just assumed it was a curse word, and so I would pop one in and then put a note to the author, and like 3 times out of 10 I was right, and the rest of them I was wrong. So it's not growing up as a teenager in Latvia was a disadvantage for contemporary literature. But it's easy to ask, and there's a lot you can get away with in putting into Google, like just typing in kas ir blank, and sometimes adding Twitter or Reddit. And there are people who love to use those terms. Very often you can find like a Delphi or some news outlet has posted an update about like a municipal or government or administrative official, and someone in the comments will have called that person the word you're looking for, and if you can find it in the right context, you're like, no, I understand. It's a politician being called this. You're like, okay, I can piece the things together. So that's been hard because these are not words that generally show up in dictionaries because they are mostly from oral tradition or just made up. Sometimes the problem with dictionaries is that the dictionary just puts you into a loop. I remember translating a sample of Visma Belshiewicz's Bille, and there's a dictionary called, I think it's Vidinnesvarden or Vidinnesvarden. It's like the Ventspils area, like a dictionary of colloquial terms. And I was so excited because I was like, okay, I don't know this word, and I looked it up, and I'm like, oh, perfect, this word does show up in the dictionary, and the example of that word was from the sentence that I was trying to translate. So I don't think I think maybe years later I had to just ask someone, but so sometimes you think you found it, but you can't always rely on dictionaries. And there's so many, Latvian takes a lot from French and from German and from Russian and transliterates it. And if you have any of those languages, that's helpful. If you don't, you're doing a lot of guesswork as a translator. And again, if you know the author, if you can talk to the author, if you know how to use a search engine, you can solve those issues. But like my grandparents didn't talk that way, so I didn't learn how to talk that way. I'm a very good girl. I'm a nice girl. And so you have to get creative or ask questions. And for Forest Daughters, as an example of what it's like being a heritage speaker doing that, as Jānis mentioned in the introduction, it is the first nonfiction book I've worked on, and so that is also different because I tend to read more fiction. But also, and this is both an advantage and a disadvantage of being a heritage speaker. Again, a blank generation Latvian-American is that working on Forest Daughters, the main obstacle was the emotional and mental baggage. There were women some of the women who were interviewed for this collection, for these interviews, they were interviewed for the interviews, well done. They were leaving the forest in the mid-1950s, which is when my parents were born, which is when my grandparents were already in the United States. And the problem is the emotional rabbit hole with that. So I had the opportunity to be in a residency in Iowa this spring, where part of my time there was spent translating, working on this translation of this book. And I thought, this will be great. I will reread the interviews and get a better feel. I will also read Voices from Chernobyl, because it's very similar in tone and in the interview style. And I thought, this will be great. And it was the most depressing thing I've ever done in my entire life. And I think I spent the second week in my residency just in the bed, like just letting all of this just wash over me, because this could have been my family. Anyone from my family could have gone into the woods, and that could have been the end of it. We could have lost family members. We could have, And we could have stayed and had the trauma, which shouldn't have been trauma, but just by association of having these people be partisans and be in the forest. And again, that emotional weight for me as a second generation Latvian American, and realizing how narrow of a possibility that was. I mean, again, the 1950s, the first episodes of I Love Lucy were being aired in the 1950s. And there were families hiding in the forest in forests in Latvia from the Russian occupation, fighting for their lives on a daily basis, trying to out-sneak wolves and not get frostbite, not get shot. And that's a huge, yeah. I don't have any more words for it because I am at a loss for words. It's an unexpected obstacle to have. An emotional mental weight is an unexpected obstacle as a translator, and it's hard sometimes to get yourself out of that mire. But the benefit of this book is that I do have a drive to translate it and share the story. So I'm not just going to go crawl back under the covers and be sad about it. I want other people to know about it. Petrus was saying that there's information, or there was a panel, I already forgot, I've been up since 4, about the Forest Brothers. And so another big advantage that we have as heritage speakers is that we are able, like this exhibit shows, we are able to share the stories that are our stories or could have been our stories with everyone, as many people as possible. So there's a lot of overthinking of meanings, both in words and in definitions and in phrasing. And I ask a lot of questions when I translate. I ask a lot of questions of the author if I can, which is another benefit of being able to speak both languages, because then I can write to them in Latvian and just like a litany of is it this or this or this or this or this or this, and to have them write back and say it's none of those, it's this, and I can go perfect. So I'm trying to sort out my brain a little bit between the benefits and the pitfalls or obstacles. So obstacles are, I didn't grow up there, or I'll say we, heritage speakers, we did not grow up there. We are not speaking Latvian in our communities, in our schools. We are not being instructed in Latvian. So that's something that I'm not going to say that we lose out on it, because I think we can gain it, we can learn it. But that's something that I did not just get handed to me. Dictionaries, not always helpful. Sometimes friends and family are not necessarily helpful. I did a sample of Meža, The Time of the Land Surveyors, which is known as the first novel, the first novel written by Latvians. And I remember asking a friend who had read it in school as required reading. I was like, well, what is, she's like, oh, if you need any help, any questions, ask me. And I took her up on that, and she was like, oh, I wish you wouldn't do that, because I just blanked it out from my memory because it was so boring and awful, and we had to read it every year. And so like the required reading is different. Growing up in the United States, we have such a different, like I said, flow of information and entertainment. So what we consume, I think, gives us an advantage. And I always tell people who want to be editors, and I think the same goes for translating, in order to be a good translator, in order to be a good editor, you need to read, and you need to read a lot. If you can also write, that's a huge plus, but read everything. Read crime novels, read nonfiction, read shampoo bottles, read habeas corpus, like read anything you can read so you can get an idea of what a tone or a voice is, what tone or voice can be required by a text. And just read. And I think that literary translators in particular, and when we do grow up as heritage speakers, is that we're good at code switching. So, you wake up in the morning, it's labrīt mamīt, labrīt papa, brokastis, jā, ola, spēķis, skola, ģērbies, tīri zobus. And then you get on the bus and you're like, hey, Brian, hey, Kendra, did you do math homework? Like you learn to switch like this. And I apologize to all the Brians and Kendras. Those are just the first very American names I could think of. So we're good at code switching because you can go back and forth between those two languages. And I think that's helpful in translation because I translate on a daily basis. I have a 6-year-old son, and I read to him almost every single day. And there are books where, when he was younger, I would take like Goodnight Moon, and I would read it to him in Latvian as I'm looking at the English. And so that ability to code switch, I'm not sitting there at bedtime going, Ar labu nakti mēnes, Ar labu nakti, it's Ar labu nakti mēnes, Ar labu nakti kres. It's like your brain is trained to switch, which is a huge advantage when it comes, especially to literary translation. Because as a big reader, I feel like often I can see a sentence in Latvian in a book, and I can hear how it could sound in English, and then I hear how it could sound a little better in English, and then like leave it even a little more like literary in English, and that's all at the same time, which sounds a little like ADD, but it's a gift. It's a gift to be able to switch back and forth, and to be able to use what our families have given us. And literary translators, specifically in the publishing world, we do have a good grasp of the English literary market and the Latvian literary market. So like I said, we know what books, movies are coming out in the United States. Being able to look at what's coming out in Latvia, what people are reading in Latvia, and for my job, to be able to look at a book and go, oh, this book could really, really do well with an English-speaking audience. Because of the voice or because of the subject matter. I'm looking at the camera because I'm a little hesitant to talk about this, but I will. There is a book that many of you might know in Latvian called Kalendārs mani sauc. And it's still, I think, debated whether the narrator is autistic or if he is eccentric. And I think that's an issue where, especially coming from Latvia, there's still a kind of discomfort and gray area when talking about either of those adjectives. But it's a book that people in Latvia really liked. My mother's Latvian book club in Minneapolis really liked it. A lot of people I've spoken to who read it in Latvian really like it. It's very straightforward. It's fairly easy reading. It is a lovely book. I don't know where it would fit into an English-speaking market, and that's just kind of a hot take. And that's coming from, I translated the whole book. I was very lucky to receive funding from Latvian Literature to do so, but I don't know where it might go because it's not, I don't think it has its moment quite yet in the English-speaking market. And that's also hard because I want to keep bringing Latvian literature. I want my Latvian translation colleagues, of which there are like 8 of us now from English into Latvian, and it's super exciting because there weren't that many 8 years ago. And everyone's brilliant and lovely, and they're so fun to work together with and talk to. And each of us has a unique experience. And this is the main thing. Each of us, whether you translate or not, we have unique experiences, unique upbringing, education, family history, and all of that can only add to our work, especially as translators. So going back to Forest Daughters, for example, it is an emotionally, mentally heavy book. I feel that it weighs on me. It lives rent-free in my brain. I am absolutely going to take that and use that to the advantage of the text in English, because it's not a froofy, throwaway, it was really hard, the woods were prickly, and we never got to shower. It was terrifying and it was awful, and they were doing something because they believed in the independence and freedom and betterment of our fatherland. And that leads me to why it's important to me to keep encouraging not just heritage speakers, but to encourage everyone to keep reading, and if you do speak Latvian, to read in Latvian, because it's only going to help. And if you can't read Latvian, to read them in the translations if you can, if they exist, because part of the longevity of the Latvian culture and its people and our heritage lies in the ability to pass on our stories, fictional or otherwise. And with the help of translation, it doesn't have to be limited to Latvians only. And that's what I said earlier about the exhibit, is this is not just for the Latvian community, whether or not they can speak Latvian. This is for everybody. Because there's so much more to our language and our culture than where it came from and where it has come from. It's also about where it's going. And that's why I put emphasis on the contemporary. And one of the main advantages, and in many ways responsibilities, should we choose to take it on as heritage speakers, particularly working in translation, is that the stories and texts we're translating for a broader readership, like I said, can have that much more of a personal purpose and background in their creation. And we can go beyond what a dictionary can provide. And again, they're the stories of our parents, our grandparents, our great-grandparents, stories that were narrowly ours, but were not by chance of fate. And I often joke about the inherited guilt to represent or take an interest in Latvian culture, especially our language. But it's precisely this inherited history and status as first, second, third, et cetera, generation Latvians that allows us to imbue our work with a level of emotion and depth of experience that, as heritage speakers, I believe we alone have access to. Thank you.